I'm very honored to welcome our next speaker in an open conversation with a moderator and the youth of the Young Americas Forum. Please join me in welcoming Samantha Power, Administrator of the United States of America Agency for International Development, and the moderator, Gustavo Alegre, journalist of NTN24, to the stage. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here today with such an amazing woman leading one of the most impressive agencies from the US government, Samantha Power, the Administrator of the US Agency for International Development. She leads 10,000 people all around the world, 100 countries. Since she took her position, she transformed USAID into expanding effort to end the COVID-19, developing gains, and it has imperiled, leading with climate change, addressing conflicts and humanitarian crises. And you know that her experience, it's wide. She was a journalist, a war correspondent. She was in Kosovo, Rwanda, Sudan, Zimbabwe, tough places for a woman and for a journalist. She's a writer, she's a diplomat. She was a US ambassador to the United Nations under President Obama, and also served at the White House National Security Council for the Obama administration. And it's a pleasure for me to be here with Samantha Power. Samantha, thank you so much.
Great to be here, Gustavo. Nice to see you all.
Let me start with a broad question for her. This is a forum led by young people, entrepreneurs, people who are eager to go around the world and solve the problems. And we have many: pandemic, education, fighting climate change, corruption. And I would like to hear from you some comments about the role that you see in these young people to address those problems. How do you see their role and the role that they can play in the future, in the near future?
Great. Well, first of all, even the list of challenges and problems you've outlined indicate that us older people haven't exactly cracked the code. We haven't exactly solved the challenges of our time. And so just on those grounds alone, we need new blood, we need help, we need different people at the table, right? I mean, it'd be one thing if we didn't have these challenges, right? So, I think, even when I think now of the privilege of running USAID, we have all of our programs, and there's one way of thinking about programs, whether in this hemisphere or any place in the world, as kind of youth empowerment programs. But if we were only to do that and have dedicated programs in youth, rather than having youth centrally part of our discussions on how to do digital transformation, or how to have an open and inclusive internet, or of course climate change, where we definitely aren't where we need to be, that would be just signing ourselves up for the same old, same old. So I think that integration, and in a sense, really the handing of the baton to young people is really important. And just because I mentioned digital, I'll just say a word about that. I mean, what is completely second nature to you all about using social media, seeing your peers and worrying about young people and how much misinformation there is on the internet, but you all having better ideas about how to combat that than people who just may have heard of Twitter for the first time like yesterday. Never mind like the new vehicles and the new social media platforms that are being used. Crowdsourcing, the ability to organize on whatever issue concerns you or your community. you just can do that in a way that we really can't. And so it's not really optional. It's not like a luxury. Oh, do we, bring young people or do we not? We will not solve the problems of our time if we don't, have youth not only at the table, but central to devising the solutions and implementing the solutions in our communities.
You're a woman, you're a mom. How do you balance leading such an important roles, time-consuming, 24 hours, and being a, let me put it that way, good mom, taking care of your family, and balance private life with public service? Poorly.
That's all. No, when I was UN ambassador and a member of President Obama's cabinet, Sheryl Sandberg's book, Lean In, came out, about us women, how we need to stand up for ourselves and lean in and claim what is ours. The same, you might say lean in, young people too, claim what's yours. And I ran into Secretary Clinton at some event when I had forgotten a change of diapers for my daughter and, ended up on the phone with Secretary Kerry at the same time I was holding her, and she just peed all over me. And without the diaper that she would have needed. And I saw Hillary Clinton. I said, she said, how's it going? And I said, they say lean in. I feel like half the time it's fall down. And she said, no, it's not lean in, it's not fall down, it's lean on. It's lean on. Like you can't, you're even when I'm here at the Summit of the Americas, and I'm trying to organize things back home for my kids, and I'd be nowhere if I didn't have support from friends, from family, being able to call my mother still and say, Mom, President Biden has called me to the Ukrainian border. I've got to go meet him. Can you fly to Florida at the last minute and take care of my kids, who are at camp? So I'm just lucky. I'm blessed to have that support. And what, I feel at USAID is I know how many people don't. And I know how many, that's why post-pandemic, so many women are not coming back to the workplace, right? Is that they had to, fundamentally, or they're trying to come back and aren't being welcomed back in the way that they need to. Because who did the pandemic fall to? To homeschool, to get your kids organized, all of that. If you're a parent, it fell to women across the hemisphere, across the world. And so we at USAID have to be incredibly conscious of the disparate effects of any one of the crises you mentioned at the beginning. The disparate effects are going to be on marginalized communities and vulnerable people, and they're going to be on women. And we need to remember that.
You work in a world full of men, and let me close this subject. And I know that this is something that is worry for many young women in the region. That they want a professional career successful as yours, and when they interact with their peers, males, in the same room, they feel the situation in which sometimes it's not comfortable, or they get displaced, or not treated with respect. What's the message, your message to the women, the young women in the region that are dealing with men in order to fight for all these problems that are common for us?
I'd say two things. I mean, first, I actually wrote, after my time in the Obama administration, I wrote a memoir called The Education of an Idealist, which was, oh, thank you. That's not a book promotion, but simply to say that in writing it, I thought to myself, if I were a young woman, what would I most need to hear? And I thought, oh, what I need to do is I need to make clear that we all have those feelings we women, no matter what your CV ends up looking like, your resume ends up looking like, it never changes. You always have that little thought bubble in your head of did I go on too long? When I raised this used to happen to me actually in the UN Security Council where I represented the United States, and it was, for a long time I was the only woman ambassador of the 15, and but I was in the United States, so I was a very powerful host country of the United Nations, largest donor, and I would make a point, and my male counterparts who, I had great relationships with, they would then make some different point. And then some guy would make the point I had made worse. And then the other male ambassadors would pick up on his point, and now there's all these studies that show that this is a recurring theme. And so it's just like that. And I feel it's my responsibility to say it's like that. I describe my brain sometimes as a bat cave, like in Batman, because all the bats are like fluttering around. I'm trying to make my point, but then my bat cave is, the bats are like, no, don't say that. Someone already said that, or and you just have to go for it. And I guess that's so the first is you're not alone. Everybody feels that way. Never compare your insides to somebody else's outsides. So everybody's like strutting along and they look like they have it all together. Chances are they have some bats in their bat cave too, maybe not as many. So try to just know that that's a normal state of affairs. But the second thing is, in a way more important, is you all are mission driven. You have something that burns you up inside, that is your reason to get out of bed or to go to work in the morning or to try to organize. And when you're at those moments of like, will I, won't I, there's so many guys, I'm not treated with respect or the way that I think I should be treated, just remember that thing that you're pursuing, that cause that is yours, and think about all the people who aren't in the room at all, and just think, I'm so damn lucky to be in the room, I'm gonna use this moment. And so what? Like, what's the worst thing that happened? They laugh at me, or they snicker, or they ignore me, or they wait for Juan to make the same point. That's compared to what people are struggling with in the world, and the more we speak, and the more when we are women and we're more than one in the room, the more that we affirm one another and lift one another up, over time that's gonna change. But if you have the goods and can deliver and really, I always say, know something about something, if you really have expertise, that in the end, over time, that is going to prevail, particularly if we have one another's backs. But we're just so, again, it's a weird way to look at it. You could be pissed about how the room looks and how the dynamics are unfolding in the room, or the half full approach is, I'm in the room, I get to be in the room. And so let me use being in the room on behalf of those who aren't yet there.
Thank you, Samantha. Thank you for your
Thanks for asking the question. Thank you. Thank you.
This is a conversation not with me, but with them. So we have some questions. Be ready for your questions. I think there is a mic over here. I'm going to be very strict with name and questions straight to the point. While people are preparing, I have one question that we collect through the internet. It's from Nicolas Sanchez Vargas from Colombia. You know that pandemic show inequality in accessing the resources needed to fight pandemic. Masks, vaccines, and so on. So the question is, in this international cooperation and agreement among countries to fight this global pandemic, is it possible to fight it with equality, with fair for everyone, but not among countries, but within countries in different type of societies, the poor, the middle class, and the people wealth and well-positioned in those societies, equality?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. Let me say a word, because I represent the United States, about the dynamics among countries, since it's no secret that countries in the North and the West had vaccines developed for a long time before they started to make their way to many of your countries. And we can't pretend that didn't happen, that countries didn't look out for their own citizens first. And so what I think is really important out of this is to build a world, and this again is where young people are going to come in, where you're not dependent on someone deigning to give up some of their supply for you, where those kinds of capabilities exist within your country preferably, or within your region, in a manner that guards against scenarios where other countries are doing what governments are elected to do, which is to look out for their own citizens. So that sounds a little bit cynical maybe, or a little bit jaded, but I think, because governments are elected for the reasons that they are, that is a structural issue in the world where you're going to see leaders privileging, the fate of their own citizens. Now, the enlightened response, and the reason that we, the United States, have led the world in vaccine donation, when President Biden came in and made that a real priority and empowered us at USAID to administer vaccines, and we've given 70 million away here in the region, but is that we have to see that enlightened self-interest means that our fates are connected, and we have to deal with public health challenges not only in our own countries but all over the world, even just for the sake of our own citizens, even for the reasons that leaders are elected. So that's why out of the pandemic we are investing so much more in health systems in the hemisphere, both because we know that that's what countries need. Health systems in many ways are much weaker today than they were 2.5 years ago, at just the time we need them to be stronger, because climate change is going to give us more diseases of that nature that take more lives. But also recognizing again that our health is connected to your health, that we can't view it in a silo. So anyway, that's on the dynamics among, but we need to think about self-sufficiency and the ability to produce in places, for example, outside the United States, and making investments in vaccine manufacturing and other commodities down here in the health sector. In terms of the question itself about equity within countries, the pandemic in the United States as well, just as in every country, I think here, elsewhere in the Americas, was, you might say, the great revealer. So I mentioned earlier the disparate effect on women, no question, whether domestic violence, educating the kids, home care, taking care of older parents who might have been affected by the pandemic, same thing across the Americas. And then if you are poor, your ability, what are you going to do when your kids are home? How are you going to keep working? And if you were dependent on that second salary from the mother in the family, or from what is that going to mean for your ability even to make ends meet? What does it mean when vaccines are much more readily available in places with more sophisticated health systems than in places where the health clinic takes miles to walk to? Like, vaccines are not accessible. Or weren't accessible for a large part of the last year and a half. Even when they became accessible in your country, they reached underdeveloped communities last. And so, as you mentioned, PPE and testing and diagnostics, just every aspect of the pandemic, if you were poor or vulnerable or living on the margins before, you were way worse off. And that's why the death rates are much more substantial, even in some cases where the testing wasn't available, so it's not even counted necessarily as a COVID death, but we just know that it is in the poorer, we have our same partners and our same constituencies and the people we know. And so getting out of our comfort zone and reaching into communities, that may mean indigenous communities, like Afro-Colombian communities, as we're trying to do, or in Guatemala, actually, for the first time, having an indigenous people strategy. To discipline ourselves to go to places that in some cases even governments don't reach out to, in many cases in fact, don't reach out to and give the primacy that they deserve.
Mm-hmm. I don't know if we have a first question ready. I want the persons who wanted to ask come to the mic.
No bat caves, no bats. Come to the mic.
Yeah, whoever...
Come up so we can hear you.
Whoever is first. My only request is, please, your name and the question. Avoid statements, go to
And I'll try to be brief so we get more questions. But please come up and stand behind the gentleman so we have more.
Good morning, Ms. Power. Nice to meet you. My name is Suri. I'm Guatemalan American, and I do international work in Mozambique and with the refugees in Baja California. My question is Guatemalan American. When I go abroad to Africa, everybody think of me highly for coming from the U.S. When I go to work with Latinos, I get looked as Latino. And here at home, I get condemned because many of them see that I am trying to open the borders to other people. So my question is, me coming from a diverse background, what is my role as an American and as a Latino? How do I make my work better and I don't know, do I represent the country?
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Well, I maybe should have said this at the beginning. I'm an immigrant to this country from Ireland, and obviously share President Biden's view, which used to be uncontroversial in the United States, you know, that the greatest source of our strength is our diversity, and is in having people with a background like yours. And I don't know your story, I don't know how you came or what your mother, you know, or your father went through to have you here in a position like this, or your grandmother for that matter. I don't know your story, but I know that whatever allowed you to take that journey gives you not only the experience that you have and the perspective you have, but reflects a kind of grit and determination that makes this country just so much stronger. I mean, it's, again, that was not controversial. The Statue of Liberty, what was on the Statue of Liberty was never controversial. It should never be controversial. It's all the studies, you know, the empirical studies show that diversity makes us better in every respect. And as somebody now privileged to run an agency of 10,000 people, you know, I'm really trying to emphasize recruiting from more diverse parts of the country, you know, traveling to historically Black colleges and universities. We now have a new memorandum of understanding with Florida International University, which is the largest Hispanic serving institution in the United States. But we need this diversity, equity, and inclusion approach also to apply to our USAID missions in many of the countries, including Guatemala, where as we hire, because most of our staff abroad are actually nationals of the countries in which we work. We have nearly 5,000 people of the 10,000 who work at USAID who are nationals of Guatemala, of Ukraine, of Afghanistan, of Togo for that matter. I mean, it is the nationals of these countries that make USAID, you know, incredibly strong. But even there, we sometimes only recruit like we have in the US from the same places and the same communities and the same circuits. So even there thinking, how can we have people from indigenous backgrounds or from rural areas, or who may not have gone to the top universities in the country, but have backgrounds that would inform our programming choices. So, you know, again, you don't have to sell me about how much you have to offer. And yeah, in our politics, which are very polarized in the United States, when you take a strong position, there's going to be probably close to half the country that disagrees vehemently and increasingly even questions one's right to have a different opinion. But diversity of opinion also is what makes this country great. So I hope you will continue to do your work. And I hope that our welcome mat to people like you who offer so much to our country can be extended near and far, and that we get back to the kind of bipartisan support for the idea of inclusion and the strength in diversity that we know explains so much of America's innovation in everything from Silicon Valley to in devising drought-resistant seeds that we now are using in rural Guatemala to try to fend off the worst effects of climate change.
Thank you.
Ms. Power.
Thank you. Ladies, we
have
want
ladies.
to step up. Go ahead.
Okay.
Good morning, Samantha. Well, my name is Paulo Garcia. I'm from Ecuador. The question is, when we consider that with international cooperation, we have systemic issues that require not only a lot of will, but also a lot of resources. And when you are USAID, you are trying to help everybody around the world, and so many countries, so many people. So in those cases, sometimes when you do a project, something like that, and you put only half of the resources that you need to do that, sometimes you receive less than half of the return. So how do you deal with those problems? Because if you want to help everybody, there's just not enough money. But if you try to help so many people at the same time, sometimes that amount of money is so much less than they need that the return probably is less than what we should receive.
Thank you.
honestly, it is a question that burns inside of me and my team the entire time, because our USAID's budget this coming year is going to be bigger than it's ever been in history. And I don't know in my lifetime that the gap has ever been so great between what our budget is and what the needs in the world are. I mean, just climate change alone and the need to help countries adapt, to help farmers adapt, to help people who live in urban communities adapt. It is really taking its toll. And so I just actually met with President Lasso of Ecuador this morning, and we had a version of this conversation, which is, okay, great, USAID is now back in Ecuador, having had to leave, previously, and now we're back. We're so pleased to be back, but as a public financing of these programs is so modest compared to childhood malnutrition, compared to the need to build a different kind of police force, compared to the environmental protection and the energy programs and the transition to clean energy that Ecuador is making. And so my main answer to you is, it can't just be, it can't just be public financing from countries like the United States. It has to be that, and we need new donors to be part of that. When countries transition away from assistance, which is what every country wants, and what I want to work USAID out of existence, right, by countries not needing assistance. But when countries make that transition, when they become new donors, that's incredibly important. Like some of the countries, the former Soviet Baltic countries, we now work with, they are our partners. That thrills me, because that's about moving along the stage of development. The Republic of Korea is a major donor now. And an incredible partner, not doing as much work in this hemisphere, of course, as might happen over time. But when you see countries graduate and then come back and give the kind of assistance that the Republic of Korea, which was flat on its back after the Korean War, the assistance that they received, it's so gratifying. So that's part of the answer, is new donors. But the other answer is, we at USAID, with you, have to find a way to bring in the local private sector, and I have to find a way with my partners in the US government to bring in the American private sector as well. And we see it in agriculture that, sometimes we will bear the first loss. We will guarantee a loan, we USAID, with our public sector financing, and that then makes it easier for the private sector to come in and think, okay, well, if you're gonna bear that loss and that initial risk, we can come in, and then maybe we can even make money over an economic investment. That's harder for civil society work, support for independent media, where it's not fundamentally going to be a situation of profit. It's going to be about, if you're an Ecuadorian American and you've done well in the United States, or if you live in Ecuador and you really believe in the strength of your democracy, can we work with you to support media that may not be able to make it but for outside assistance? So it really depends on the sector as to how much scope there is for bringing in other forms of investment. But we have to get way more creative than we have been. It can't just be traditional public sector financing, given that growing gap, and given that when you have half the resources you need, you're going to have, as you say, have half the results or even less.
Thank you, Paulo.
Thank you.
Let me follow up with
Sure.
something that you mentioned, but you didn't mention, actually. Give me 1 second.
Yeah. No,
corruption.
Yeah.
Corruption is one of the cancers that affects, unfortunately, most of the Latin American democracies.
Yeah.
It's not exclusive from this hemisphere, but it exists. And when you arrive with money, with programs, and you have to deal with corruption that is local, and it's embedded inside governments or private sector, how do you deal with this?
Well, first, let me say, President Biden is actually the first American president who has made combating corruption, has declared it a core national security priority. And I'm the first USAID administrator that has set up an anti-corruption task force at USAID, precisely dedicated to this issue. But I want to be clear, in the past, the United States has always cared about corruption in terms of our money. And that's kind of at the core of your questions, like, if we're investing in a country, we want our money to go to good use. But what we're doing now is not just that, not just saying, okay, is there fraud, is there waste, is there abuse, is there corruption in terms of, when we support a health program, is the money reaching the beneficiaries? When we support education, is the money actually helping buy textbooks or refurbish schools, or is it going to some crook? We care about all of that. We have to. And that's why working with USAID is sometimes super complicated for organizations, because there's a lot of checks and balances to avoid that kind of corruption. But there's a systemic kind of corruption that affects people's lives, even if they never work with USAID. We want to make sure now that we have programming. For example, when the Dominican Republic President Abinader, or President Lasso for that matter, in Ecuador come in on an anti-corruption agenda and platform, that we are able to help them, develop a new procurement law so that they are publishing online who's actually getting the contracts, which is where a ton of corruption occurs. In the environmental sector, when it comes to illegal trafficking, of lumber, or when it comes to some of what happens in the Amazon, our programs focusing on those actors who are profiting from your natural resources, your generation's future. And so that's where we're trying to ramp up our programming as well, which is complementary to, but quite different from the traditional mindset of like, our money can't go to waste. That we have to guarantee. We have a lot of checks that I hope guard against that. But similarly, when young people speak, when they go out and they elect leaders that want to fight corruption and that buck these trends that you described, we want to be there and support them. And to the prior question, we need to catalyze the private sector to see something different is happening in this country. If you come in with foreign investment, or if you come in willing to build your factory in a country that is fighting corruption, that is going to help leaders at the municipal, at the regional, at the national level show their people that there's an economic benefit to doing hard things. And that's been the problem. I think we are in a democratic recession, in part because when there have been democratic openings, there hasn't been enough economic results on democratization or on greater respect for human rights. And so then there's a backlash against reformers, demagogues come in, and then you start to see more corruption. And so we have to have there being an economic dividend on the political reform agenda that we seek as well.
Next.
Great, hello. Hi, my name is Kyla Denwood and I'm from Chicago. A big fan of Administrator Power, thank you for being here. My question is, because we are at the Young Americas Forum, I know there are many of us that want to pursue international development or humanitarian affairs projects in our own homes, but because we are young, may not have the assistance of our governments or big donors to help us. So I was wondering if you had any advice as to where we could start.
Are you talking about in the United States, or you're talking about in any country?
I mean, I'm from the US, so we could talk about here, but
any
country, I guess.
So just across the Americas. I mean, look, I think the main thing that holds young people back, apart from older people, is a sense, of sort of your point, which is the problems are so big, I have so little. How am I gonna chip away? How am I gonna make a difference? And I think we're fortunate to live at a time where there is a robust network of civil society organizations where eventually, once you've gone to university, because I know there's some here who are still university age or may have just graduated, but once you get your experience doing your internships or volunteering, those opportunities hopefully will come along where you'll be able to latch on to an organization that is doing something that you care about. That's my hope for you, that you'll have those opportunities. But in the meantime, thinking that I have to make a big difference to make any difference, I think is a counterproductive way of thinking about things. And so I'll quote here President Obama, who I used to, have, debates with when I had the chance to work for him in his administration, and sometimes I'd want to do these really big things, and we may not have the resources, or Congress may be standing in the way, or all the things that make change hard, and he would say, Sam, remember, better is good. better is good. And sometimes we want what's needed, or we want what's best. We may not be able to get, and especially when you're a young person and you're just starting out. And so the question is, can you make something better for someone? And if you lower the bar on yourself, if you lower the pressure on yourself, it's much easier to start. And then lo and behold, you know, you may not change the world, right? But if you change some individual world or make something better, whether through volunteering or through tutoring or doing something, you know, really small, you gain that experience that you will then bring as the stage on which you work gets bigger over time. But just thinking to oneself, better is good, I feel like can be consolation sometimes, and a reminder that if everybody took that approach, just to try to make something a little bit better, then together, right, especially, you know, if you take up all the young people, if they took up that charge and were dedicated to changing just something small in their communities, even in their own families, if you aggregate that, you know, across a lot of people, that can do more than make things a little bit better. So, thank you.
Thank you. Love your city.
Hello, my name is Kevin Cabral. I'm Dominican American, and I'm a very big follower of your work. Thank you for everything you have done. So my question is, in your perspective, what is the biggest challenge the United States has in terms of development?
Well, I think I've already addressed the resource gap. And I can't underscore enough the exponential damage that climate change is doing to all of our development objectives. I mean, look at the SDGs. Some of you operate using that, you know, in your countries, developing national action plans around the SDGs. Look at the progress even we were making on the MDGs before. And it looked like things would progress apace. But when you start to see, you know, every year hotter than the year before, or with more rainfall or more drought, we have too much water, we have too little water, right? And then we're seeing the good news on climate change is we're seeing the private sector move when it comes to renewables and clean energy transitions. I mean, again, too late, you know, or later than what we need. But nonetheless, that's happening. And once the private sector starts going, once you can make money off something, there's a pretty good chance that over time you're going to start to see really profound change. And you know, we see it in the United States, we see it in our development relationships around the world. Countries are really eager, not the big fossil fuel producers, but most countries are really eager to move to solar, to move to renewables, to move to wind, and we can support them in doing that. But where it's really challenging is adaptation, which is not how do you lower emissions, it's how do you deal with the emissions that have already gotten too high and the damage on the climate that has already been done. And there, we haven't been able to attract the private sector in the same way. And so that gap that we've been talking about just goes bigger and bigger as small island states, you know, have to begin planning, like going door to door to say, where can my people move to? What other countries can we go to? Because our shorelines are eroding, or because we can look ahead 10, 20 years and know that the sea levels are rising so much that in a whole part of our country, people aren't going to be able to live. And then you run into like migration challenges and you know, the difficulty of actually finding a welcome in other countries, given the movements. Look at the changing complexion of even the people who are coming to the southern border of the United States. You know, there's the rate of migration actually within Latin America is increasing apparently at 17 times the rate that the rate of migration to the United States is increasing. And we know that that's increasing at historic rates, and it's because people are looking around. Nobody wants to leave their home, by and large. I mean, they want to provide for their families where they are, but when you see the food crises compounded now by Putin's invasion of Ukraine, but also fueled by these pre-existing conditions, whether it's natural disasters like hurricanes or unseasonable weather that changes the dynamics for agriculture, which is a huge source of income and wealth in the region. So I think that those gaps on adaptation are really tough. And then you look at the pandemic we've just had, every scientist is telling us we're going to have more of those because of the warmer temperatures and so forth. So that, I think a lot comes back to our warming planet, the need to move much more aggressively to stop the temperature rises so we can limit the damage, but also, especially for those of us who bear the greatest responsibility as the largest emitters, to be in a position to dedicate more public and private sector resources to helping countries adapt. I think those are monumental challenges.
Thank you. Let's have a question, the last one, I think, from a woman. Yes. Your name and the question, please.
Sure. My name is Dr. Injeri Osborne. I'm a graduate of the Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland. I'd just like to thank you for your words of encouragement. It really spoke to me. You're speaking on the theme of self-sufficiency, as well as the interconnectedness of the 5 C's of youth development that we all have had to grapple with, to think about how we can affect change by addressing each one of those 5 C's. One of the things that I would like to just mention is the fact that the stress that the pandemic caused on our individual countries, the fact that it breeded even more corruption in some countries, that sentiment of pessimism felt throughout the Americas. And I just believe like having more forums such as this, where we have female leaders such as yourself speaking to inspire young women like myself to figure out how we can address those problems in our individual countries. And so I wanted to ask you, just to bring it back, what difficulties have you experienced as a female leader, and how would you speak to, even our young women in the audience here and those online, just about how we can address that imposter syndrome that seems to be always there, and how we can just step up to the plate when is needed, and to really inspire other young women in our countries.
Well, let me say that in the same spirit of your comment, which is in a sense, representation really matters, right? So to be here, and again, I feel very, very privileged to be among you who are the change makers in your countries, and often have, faced many more barriers than I have faced in my career to be where I am today. And so that's very inspiring for me. But I think in the spirit of representation, what we again, of older generations need to do, irrespective of our gender, is make sure that there's a role for representation of you, of somebody who is young and female and has her own or his own story to tell, and to make young people feel like they can have a role in the change making. I think, in addition to the comments I've made previously about being a woman and some of the sort of, challenges along the way, I guess one of the biggest things that I think you have to grapple with in the Americas, women of all ages have to grapple with, but still young women, is unconscious bias. And so I'll just give you one example. It actually, interestingly, it doesn't involve a Latin American ambassador, but when I was UN ambassador, we had the privilege, just by virtue of timing, to choose the next Secretary General of the UN. And as you may know, despite the fact that the UN has been around since 1945, there's never been a female Secretary General, right? It's crazy. So it's very challenging to become Secretary General, because you have to make it through Russia, China, the United States, United Kingdom, and France, the 5 permanent members, and then also through the whole General Assembly. So it's not easy to become Secretary General. But I was having a conversation with a European ambassador, very, very progressive, about how I thought it was time, well past time, at that time it was 70 plus years since the founding of the UN, it was time like to have a female Secretary General. And he kind of, he took it on board and he said, yeah, he said, absolutely. He said, but just make sure that she's competent. I was like, what? And I mentioned this to my Jordanian counterpart, whose name is Dina Kawar, female representative from a country in the Middle East, very, itself very rare. And Dina, who's now Jordan's ambassador to the United States, really amazing woman. But I mentioned that I just was coming out of this, I was just like, what is it exactly about this exchange that is making me completely insane? And she's like, she said, what does he actually think? Does he think that some woman is gonna say, well, I was gonna get my hair done today, but I decided, no, I'll just become Secretary General, And she said, why would that kind of comment never be made, in the context of some other, male candidate? And so one can get very angry about it, but I actually think to laugh about it, to render it as absurd as it is, to tell the story publicly. I know this guy, because I included this in my book, The Education Idealist, and I know he's like, because he's progressive. He didn't mean it, it's the wiring, at a certain point. So, and I think your generation, like I watch it on social media, the irreverence, the way of turning things around, the way of, bringing in pop culture, I think there are ways to go meta on it all in a way that can, begin to chip away at this. But I say that, I was at the inauguration, is that what we call it? The inaugural ceremony yesterday, and I was looking at the litany of leaders from the hemisphere, and it's not terribly diverse, at least in terms of, female representation, that's for sure. But then I see Kamala Harris, and how long it took for us, and her getting to give the welcome, and how inspiring that has been to my daughter, to see her in that role. And so every one of you in leading an organization or in taking a role in, going before a school, going back to the place you went to school and speaking and describing the work that you do or the issues you care about, you're chipping away with the women and with the young women and with the young men about what's normal, about what's doable. And so just know that responsibility unfortunately starts young, but you're bearing it with great dignity and grace. So we're very lucky to have you. Thank you.
So much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I think we have to finish. I'm sorry, we don't have much time. We have the presidents almost here and the Secretary General. I'm sure that the questions are very interesting. I'm so sorry. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Samantha,
thanks, everybody.
I want to give you 1 minute at the very end of this conversation to tackle one that I think is the topic and kind of elephant in the room. Many people, some people in Latin America believe that the US agency that you lead, it's the kind of institution that the US government uses for political objectives, proposing development. And I think it's fair if we finish giving you the opportunity to explain if this is what is going on and how the US agency that you lead separate these two things.
Yeah, I appreciate the chance to answer that question. And I think it is certainly something we hear. So let me first say, and I was talking to our friend from Ecuador, USAID had to leave Ecuador because of charges that it was political. There are a lot of accusations by individuals, let's say, across the hemisphere, that because USAID focuses on anti-corruption work, or because we fund independent media, or the training of independent media, or because we support free and fair elections, that's too political. So I want to separate out that kind of charge, because fundamentally, we make no apology for trying to strengthen the rule of law and respect for human rights as part of our programming. So that's not what's meant, I think, in your question, but that is something that we hear, oh, it's so political, it's, siding with the opposition. We don't support any political party or any particular political agenda. But we do have, as a North Star, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and a desire to see the rule of law strengthened and not eroded. And unfortunately, we've ended up in with much more friction in certain relationships with certain governments, because if there is democratic backsliding going on, some of the organizations that we fund are going to say that. And that's the nature of supporting the rule of law. So that's one aspect of the charge. I think then separate, which is what you're talking about, is USAID doing the bidding of the United States? Are we pursuing our foreign policy objectives rather than development objectives? And there's no question that USAID is a US government agency. We're not going to get away from that, nor should we. But I think if you look at President Biden and our worldview, we believe it is in our foreign policy interest to be meeting the needs, the food needs of people who are now paying sometimes 30% more for wheat. We believe it is in our interest to help you adapt to the worst effects of climate change. We believe it is in our interest when there's a hurricane or an earthquake to send search and rescue people to help with an earthquake and to send additional assistance, humanitarian assistance when a hurricane has ravaged whole neighborhoods. So the work that we do fundamentally is development and humanitarian work. And what I'm trying to emphasize is that it is your voices, local organizations, local leaders, young people, that help us define what our priorities are as we figure out, in the sea of need, which issues we prioritize and where, our evaluations of the work that we do are not just done by some consultant who comes from Washington, but that you are the ultimate judge of whether our programs are delivering for your development needs. So we believe that if we can support your development, that yes, that is in our interest, guilty as charged. We believe that will make for a more stable, prosperous hemisphere that will help us combat future pandemics and nip viruses in the bud so they don't spread. For sure, there's, again, that relationship to US interests, but if we are better at elevating your voices, at working with local organizations, what we are doing is working ourselves out of jobs so that your growth is more inclusive growth, so that your development isn't just, certain communities benefiting from that development, but much more broad-based, so that marginalized people are at the table, and sometimes sooner they're at our table than they are at tables with their own governments, And that is the kind of catalytic role I think that we can play. So fundamentally, we look at your development objectives and try to graft our programming onto your education, health, rule of law, climate, energy, and other needs.
Samantha Power, U.S. Administrator, thank you so much for your leadership and your time today.
Thank you, and congrats on presenting your charter, your youth manifesto to the president's coming up next. That's going to be a great event. So congrats to you, and thank you for being here.